For a lot of my life, maybe of yours as well, being someone who goes to church is sort of assumed to mean that you're a quiet, mild-mannered, milquetoast, respectable person. Church-going is kind of a shorthand for, they're respectable, they stay inside the lines, they keep things sort of as they are, they're not going to make waves or ruffle feathers, they're church-going. For an awful lot of Christian history, at least in our more recent time, people assume that to be a Christian was pretty much to be bland, boring, irrelevant, and make no real impact or difference to the way the world actually operates. And that basically a reason to be a Christian, at least a reason to go to church, was it made you respectable in the eyes of your neighbor. You were more likely to be seen as a good, upstanding citizen if you went to church. It's interesting how the charges against Christians in the book of Acts sound so different. We saw this past week in our ongoing weekly study of the book of Acts how when Paul and Silas and his companions come to the city of Thessalonica, the public gossip is these people who have been turning the world upside down have come to our town too. They look at Christians and they don't say, some respectable people who will just sort of keep the status quo in place and make sure nothing ever changes, who will keep their heads down and make no difference in the actual flow of anybody's lives. They don't say that about Christians. They say, these are the ones who've been turning the world upside down. And then they go on to say, this Paul and Silas, they're announcing that there's another king named Jesus, and that following him is going to lead us in ways that are contrary to the decrees of the emperor. In other words, to be a follower of Jesus meant we might not be good Romans anymore. We might not be good citizens of the empire anymore. Following Jesus might just be subversive and turn everything upside down. How did we get so far so that in contemporary parlance, being a good church-going person meant that you were just going to keep your head down and you were a respectable, mild-mannered person like Clark Kent? And in the first century, we were seen as subversive and dangerous of all the empire's ways of doing things. Sometimes I think we forget really that what Christianity brought in its message about Jesus, the crucified and risen Messiah, who is gathering this whole new kind of community of not just the rich and the elite, but the poor and even the enslaved, not just of men in their official titles, but women as well, even though they were looked down on in much of their wider culture, that this was a pretty subversive way of living. This was pretty counter-cultural. And the empire had this very, very different way of seeing the world compared to Christianity. Sometimes I think we forget just how different the way of Jesus is from the dominant narrative of power that shows up over and over again in history, including to the present day. The letterheads change on the empire, but the same mode of thinking, the same playbook, right? Empires think in terms of who's in charge, who's got the power, who can we dominate. Everybody needs to be afraid that there's not enough to go around, and the only way to get more is we've got to conquer more and more territory, take what somebody else has, and amass for the head and the center of the empire. There's this very sort of top-down, we have to dominate somebody else way of thinking in the Roman Empire. And again, empires ever since continue to use that playbook. Christianity shows up on the scene and doesn't ask, who can we dominate? Who's underneath me? Or who I have to worry about being above me? Christianity asked a different question because of, in Jesus, God coming to be with us. It created this whole different play of not who can I dominate, but who can I serve? Who can I work alongside of? Who can I share a table with? Because God has come to be at our side, not dominate, lording over us, but at our side, even to die for us, to wash feet among us, and then sending us out to do the same. It was indeed radical. When the people in Thessalonica say about the Christians, those people who've been turning the world upside down have come to this town, they weren't joking. Christianity really did seem subversive. It seemed like it was turning everything on its head. I wonder if that's something we've forgotten, or that we forget just how really radical, how countercultural, not just the Christian message is, but the whole Christian way of life really was meant to be all along. We were never violent. We were never meant to be, starting riots and trying to overthrow the Romans or launching a coup. Often, you'll see in the book of Acts, like we saw last week, people who are hostile to Christians saying we have to frame them and make it seem like they're troublemakers, and they'll start a riot and then blame it on the Christians. That happens later on in in history. In the 60s AD, the Emperor Nero wanted to blame Christians for a fire that broke out in Rome and launched this official empire-wide persecution of Christians. We weren't the ones starting violence. We weren't the ones resorting to destruction and chaos. But to accept the message of Jesus, that Jesus' way of doing things is really God's way, that the emperor is wrong about how to run the universe and how to order people's lives, that God's way isn't this sort of top-down domination, intimidation approach, but God's way looks like serving and love and a cross rather than conquering your enemies. That's going to be seen as subversive. As we continue walking our way through the book of Acts, one of the things we keep asking ourselves is, what do these old stories mean for us in our lives today? And I wonder if maybe we need to hear these ancient words that remind us from our roots. We were people seen as turning the world upside down, that to confess Jesus as our Lord might sometimes mean that we turn away from the ways of the empire, that we say, no, the Caesar's way isn't our way, that we offer an alternative. We embody a different way of life, one that's grounded in self-giving love, that's looking to lift up those who've been stepped on, whose tools aren't the sword or the club or tools of intimidation, but the wash basin and the towel, the gift of broken bread and a seat at a table. That really is radical. That is like turning the world upside down. And the reason we keep trying to be that kind of countercultural community is because, just like they said about us in the book of Acts, we follow a different king. We say there's a different king named Jesus. And sometimes following that Jesus is going to mean we act in ways all counter to what the emperor says. Join us on Thursday as we continue our Bible study. We're going to be heading into Acts chapter 17 and what happens when Paul goes to the cultural capital of Athens and tries to make sense of the good news of Jesus in a culture that sees the world very, very differently. Join us for that conversation around the table, 1 o'clock here at Community of Christ, or if you can't catch up, join us with these video summaries along the way. See you on Thursday.